At first, it was just a ridiculous fine, one of those petty HOA citations that make you roll your eyes. But what if I told you that tiny green slip of paper would unravel a dark scheme hiding in plain sight? They thought I was just another resident who would quietly pay up and move on. What they didn't know, I'm the chief of police, and the moment I dug deeper, I found something much worse than unfair rules, an entire corrupt system designed to deceive and control hardworking residents. What happens when the people enforcing the rules are the real criminals? Well, you'll soon be cheering as the hunter becomes the hunted. If you believe no one should be bullied in their own home, smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Ever tangled with an HOA nightmare before? Let's hear your story, because every voice matters. And together we make sure these power trips end now. I'll never forget that morning. It started just like any other day, but by the time the sun set, our entire neighborhood would never be the same. I stepped out of my house, coffee in one hand, car keys in the other, ready for another long shift at the police station. The air was crisp, and for a moment, everything seemed peaceful. That was until I saw it. Something bright green tucked under my windshield wiper. My first thought, another takeout menu, but as I got closer, my stomach tightened. A violation notice. A $2,000 fine for improper lawn maintenance. You gotta be kidding me. I turned to look at my front yard. The grass was green, trimmed, and neat, just as it had been for the last 16 years I'd lived in Oak Ridge Meadows. But apparently, my lawn wasn't up to standard. And then I heard it, the distinct sharp clicks of high heels on pavement. Good morning. The voice was sugary sweet, but there was an unmistakable mockery in the tone, the kind that made my blood boil before I even turned around. Karen McAllister, the newest HOA board member. She had moved in 6 months ago, immediately started campaigning for a board position, and ever since she got elected, the neighborhood had been in absolute chaos. She stood there in a crisp white blazer, tablet clutched in her manicured hands, a self-satisfied smirk painted across her face. I held up the notice. Mind explaining this? My lawn meets all reasonable standards. Karen barely even looked at me. Instead, she kept tapping away at her screen like I wasn't worth her full attention. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA guideline states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is approximately 3.5. I blinked at her. You're joking, right? A half inch. You're fining me over half an inch of grass. Karen finally looked up, her eyes glinting with amusement. Rules are rules, Mr. Johnson, and you of all people should understand that. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to suppress the frustration rising in my chest. Years on the force had taught me how to deal with difficult people, but something about Karen made my skin crawl. I've been busy with a major case at work. I'll mow it this weekend. Karen gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest, as if I had just told her I planned to burn the whole neighborhood down. Oh dear, we simply can't have residents choosing when they feel like following the rules. The fine doubles if it's not paid within 72 hours. I clenched my jaw. That's ridiculous. But she wasn't done yet. Oh, and you might want to do something about those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list. My entire body tensed. My late wife's garden gnomes. The ones she had collected for years before she passed away. The ones I had carefully arranged and kept exactly as she had left them. Karen sneered. Tacky little things, aren't they? I can see why you'd be attached, but we have to think of the property values. I felt my fingers curl around the violation notice. They've been here for over a decade. Karen's lips curled into a wicked smile. New board, new rules. She tapped at her tablet again before flashing a sickeningly sweet grin. We're bringing this neighborhood into the modern age. No more tacky decorations lowering property values. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but Karen had already moved on, clicking her way toward my neighbor's house. Emily. Emily was an ER nurse. She had just gotten home from a brutal night shift, dark circles under her tired eyes, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline of saving lives all night. And now Karen was snapping pictures of her garbage bins. Excuse me, Emily called out, still groggy. What are you doing? Karen scoffed. Bins must be brought in by 6 a.m. Yours were out at 6:14. You'll be receiving a notice. Emily's face turned pale. Are you serious? I just worked a 14-hour shift. I got home minutes ago. Karen folded her arms. Not my problem. If you cared about this neighborhood, you'd follow the rules. Emily let out a shaky breath. I was literally saving lives last night. Can't you show a little understanding? Karen smirked. I don't make exceptions for careless people. I watched as Emily's lip quivered with frustration. That was when something inside me shifted. This wasn't about my lawn. This wasn't about some ridiculous garden gnome policy. This was targeted harassment. I had seen power-hungry board members before, but Karen was something else entirely. She didn't just enforce the rules, she used them as a weapon, twisting them to make people's lives miserable. Watching Emily's exhausted face as she held back anger, I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I took another look at my violation notice, then at the other bright green slips plastered across my neighbor's doors. This wasn't just a few harmless fines. This was a pattern. Karen wasn't trying to maintain order. She was trying to control people. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, going through every HOA document I could find. Sarah sat beside me, flipping through pages of bylaws, financial statements, and board meeting minutes. I highlighted every section that seemed questionable, every vague regulation that could be twisted to Karen's advantage. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to a clause buried deep in the financial records. The HOA just increased its security budget by $30,000, but there's no record of where the money actually went. I frowned. HOA security. Since when did a suburban neighborhood need a security force? Sarah pulled up a community email on her phone. Karen sent this out last month. Something about increased patrols to prevent rule violations. That explained the new faces I had seen walking the streets. The men in black polos with HOA security stitched across the back. I had assumed they were just contracted guards, but the more I thought about it, the more something felt off. The next morning, I left early to do some digging. At the end of our street, I saw one of the security officers standing near a stop sign, tablet in hand, scanning the neighborhood. I pulled up next to him and rolled down my window. Morning, I said casually. You guys new around here. He barely looked at me. Just doing our job, sir. Enforcing HOA compliance. I glanced at his uniform. No badge number. No company logo. Just the words HOA security printed across his chest. Who hired you? He hesitated. The board, he finally said. I nodded, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. Real security companies had licensing requirements, credentials, and regulations to follow. This guy had none of it. I parked and stepped out of my car, watching as two other security officers walked up to a house, snapping pictures of a front porch. When the homeowner stepped outside, the officers turned and walked away without a word. No explanation, no citation, just quiet intimidation. I clenched my fists. This wasn't about property values or lawn maintenance. This was about power, and Karen was using these so-called officers to enforce it. I pulled out my phone and started recording. If these guys weren't legitimate, then what Karen was doing wasn't just abuse of power, it was illegal. That night, I decided it was time to take this to the next level. I had dealt with corrupt officials before, but Karen was on another level, weaponizing rules, enforcing fear, and running the HOA like her personal empire. I sat at my desk, reviewing the footage I had taken of the so-called security team. Their behavior wasn't just suspicious, it was unlawful. No IDs, no credentials, no actual enforcement authority. These weren't trained officers. They were hired enforcers, operating outside any legal boundaries. Sarah leaned over my shoulder, arms crossed. This isn't just HOA overreach, she said. This is organized intimidation. I nodded, knowing she was right, but proving it would take more than a few recorded videos. We need real evidence, I said. If we can prove that Karen is using HOA funds to pay an illegal security team, we can take her down. Sarah tapped on her tablet. The HOA's next board meeting is in 2 days. If we can get enough homeowners to show up, we can force them to release the financial records. I exhaled slowly. Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. The next morning, I started knocking on doors. The first few neighbors were hesitant, their eyes darting toward the security patrols. But as soon as I mentioned the financial discrepancies, they started listening. Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had lived here for decades, clutched my arm. They threatened to fine me for feeding birds in my own yard. She whispered, "I've never been scared to live here until now." I reassured her, "Not for much longer." Word spread fast. By the end of the day, dozens of homeowners had agreed to attend the meeting. That night, as I took out the trash, I noticed a black SUV idling down the street, its headlights off. A figure sat in the driver's seat, watching. My stomach tightened. Karen was catching on. The next morning, a new violation notice was taped to my door. A second fine, this time for unauthorized lawn decorations. My fist clenched. The garden gnomes. They had been in the exact same place for over a decade. This was retaliation. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Drop it. Some fights aren't worth it." I stared at the text, my pulse pounding. Karen wasn't just using security officers to enforce rules. She was using them to silence people. Sarah saw the message over my shoulder. She didn't flinch. "This means we're getting close." That night, I installed extra security cameras around my house, saved copies of all the violation notices, and backed up my video evidence to multiple drives. Karen had been untouchable for too long. But now, she had finally made a mistake. She thought she could scare us into silence. She had no idea who she was up against. The night of the board meeting, the community center was packed like never before. Dozens of homeowners filled the seats, their expressions a mixture of frustration and determination. I stood near the back, scanning the room, taking note of the tension hanging in the air. Karen sat at the front table, flanked by two other board members, her signature smirk plastered across her face. She had no idea what was coming. The meeting began with the usual scripted nonsense, budget updates, maintenance reports, but the moment the floor was open for homeowner concerns, I stepped forward. "I have a question about the HOA's recent security spending," I said, holding up printed financial records. "Can you explain why $30,000 were allocated to security services, but no payments were made to a licensed firm?" Karen's smirk faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained composure. "That information is confidential," she said smoothly. "The board has full discretion over budgetary decisions." I nodded. "Right, but according to state regulations, all financial reports must be transparent to homeowners. So, unless you can provide official documentation proving these security officers are legally certified, I'm filing a formal complaint." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. "HOA security is necessary to maintain order," she snapped. "I'm not going to sit here and justify every dollar spent when our community's safety is at stake." "Safety?" I let out a humorless laugh. "Is that what you call it? Because I have video footage of your security team trespassing on private property, issuing fines without justification, and intimidating homeowners into compliance." The room erupted in whispers, people turning to one another in shock. That's when Sarah stepped forward, holding up her tablet. "And if anyone needs more proof, here's a list of the fake violations issued over the past 3 months. Dozens of fines, all targeted at homeowners who questioned Karen's policies." A homeowner stood up. "You fined me $300 for having my Christmas lights up 2 days past the deadline." Another voice joined in. "You threatened my son with a trespassing charge for playing basketball in our driveway." More and more voices joined the uproar, the weight of Karen's abuse finally crashing down. She pounded the gavel, her face red with anger. "Order. If any of you continue this disruption, you will be removed." I folded my arms. "With what security team?" Because as of this morning, I reported them for impersonating law enforcement, and the police are currently investigating. Karen went pale. I turned to the crowd. "It's time we take back our neighborhood. Karen has abused her power for too long. We demand an immediate vote to remove her from the board." Cheers erupted. Homeowners raised their hands in agreement. Karen stood up, slamming her folder shut, but the power had already shifted. She wasn't in control anymore. By the time the vote was over, Karen was out, and the entire neighborhood was celebrating. Cheers erupted throughout the community center, homeowners shaking hands, hugging, and breathing sighs of relief. For the first time in months, people felt like they had their voices back. Karen stood frozen at the front of the room, her face drained of color, gripping her clipboard like it could somehow save her. The other board members, realizing the tide had turned, quickly distanced themselves from her. "This meeting is adjourned," one of them announced, banging the gavel. But no one was leaving. They wanted answers. As homeowners swarmed the front, demanding refunds for their fake fines, I stepped back, watching Karen try to talk her way out of it. She stammered about policies, about order, but no one was listening anymore. Sarah leaned in. "You did it." I shook my head. "We all did. But it's not over yet." The real police investigation was just beginning. Karen had ruled this neighborhood through fear, but now, her biggest nightmare had come true. Her power was completely gone. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message from my dad. "Just got confirmation. Those security officers have no valid licenses. State fraud charges incoming." I showed Sarah the message, and for the first time that night, I let myself relax. We weren't just getting rid of Karen. We were making sure she never did this to anyone else again. Homeowners were already organizing, planning how to reform the HOA into something fair, something transparent. The fear that had once loomed over this community had vanished. Outside, people pulled down the ridiculous security warning signs Karen had put up, dumping them into trash bins. It was symbolic. The reign of intimidation was over. I caught sight of Karen slipping out the back exit, her once perfect posture now slumped in defeat. Sarah nudged me. "Should we stop her?" I shook my head. "She's not our problem anymore. The law will handle her now." A police car pulled up just as she reached the parking lot. Two officers stepped out, speaking to her in hushed tones. Karen's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't argue. She knew she had lost. I exhaled, finally feeling the weight lift from my chest. Sarah squeezed my hand. "It's finally over." I looked around at our neighbors, smiling, laughing, relieved. This wasn't just about removing Karen. This was about taking back our homes. As we walked toward our house, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The battle had been exhausting, but in the end, we had won. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer, like a storm had finally passed. The once oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by the warmth of a community finally reclaiming its identity. Homeowners greeted each other with genuine smiles, no longer worried about surveillance or unfair fines. The ridiculous violation notices that had once littered front doors were now crumpled in trash bins where they belonged. Sarah and I sat on our porch, watching kids ride their bikes, neighbors chat over fences, and the simple beauty of normal life returning. It was strange how much fear had controlled everyone for so long, and how quickly it disappeared once Karen was out of power. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message from my dad. HOA corruption case officially opened. Multiple fraud charges pending. Looks like she won't be bothering anyone for a long time. I exhaled, leaning back against the porch railing. Justice wasn't just a concept. It was real, and it was happening. Sarah glanced at my phone, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. Good. She deserves every bit of it. Across the street, Mrs. Patel was hanging a new welcome sign on her porch, one that read, "This is our neighborhood, and we stand together." I had never been prouder to live here. The first community meeting without Karen was already scheduled, and for the first time, it wasn't about control, it was about unity. People were discussing real improvements, fair policies, and ways to ensure no one would ever abuse power again. Sarah nudged me playfully. "So, Chief, what do we do now?" I laughed, stretching my arms as I watched the peaceful scene around us. "We enjoy it," I said simply. "We fought for this. We earned this. And now, for the first time in a long time, we are home."